After dropping my son at the airport for a trip to London, my housekeeper, who has worked for us for 10 years, texted me. She said, "Do not go home, check the cameras." I stood frozen when I saw my son walking through my front door with three men in suits carrying sledgehammers. I am Richard, 71 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful infrastructure developer, I built a solid foundation for my loved ones, but maintained a blind trust in my son. Last Monday, he asked me to drop him off for a business trip to catch up on the way to the airport. Between the departure terminal and the baggage claim, my son leaned forward, hugging me. "You know, Dad, you are lucky we take such good care of you. Just go relax at the lake this weekend." I simply smiled and wished him a safe flight. That afternoon, I logged into my security system, watched him prepare to demolish my home. Over the next few days, I worked with my lawyer to legally erase his future. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Nashville, Tennessee meant hard work to outsiders. But inside our growing contracting business, absolute loyalty permeated every corner. Our custom-built estate with its sprawling lawn and handcrafted sunroom was a fortress of memories I could never quite let go. My home office, filled with architectural drafts at my late wife Catherine's insistence despite my preference for the job site, became my sanctuary. From my early 20s through my retirement, I maintained perfect business ethics, joined elite developer societies, and provided everything my family could ever want. The afternoon started like any normal Monday. The bright sun was beating down hard on the asphalt as I navigated the heavy traffic on Interstate 65. I had just dropped my 38-year-old son Bradley at the Nashville International Airport. He had kissed my cheek, grabbed his expensive leather carry-on bag, and told me he would call me as soon as he landed in London for his major technology conference. I remember feeling a sense of deep paternal pride as I watched him walk through the sliding glass doors of the departure terminal. Since Catherine passed away 4 years ago from a sudden illness, Bradley and his wife Monica were the only real family I had left. They had been stepping up lately, taking over the family dinners, checking in on me constantly, and making sure I was resting. I honestly thought they were just being fiercely protective of an older widower. I had absolutely no idea they were simply laying the groundwork for a complete and total quarantine of my life. I merged into the middle lane, turning up the radio to listen to a classic rock station, letting the familiar rhythm wash over me. I was looking forward to a quiet week at my house in Franklin. I had spent 40 years sweating on dusty construction sites all across the state, turning a very small contracting business into a major regional infrastructure empire. That house was my masterpiece, a personal tribute to Catherine. It was my sanctuary, and the only place I truly felt at peace. I was about 10 miles away from my exit when my phone buzzed violently in the cup holder. I ignored it at first, keeping my eyes on the bright red brake lights ahead of me. But then it buzzed again, and again. 3 rapid, frantic vibrations that immediately spiked my heart rate. I grabbed the phone, fully expecting a text from Bradley saying he forgot his passport or left his laptop in my truck. Instead, the notification on my screen was from Maria. Maria is an incredible, hardworking woman from Mexico who has been my loyal housekeeper for a decade. She knows my house better than I do, and she is practically family to me. She never texts me unless it is an absolute emergency. I tapped the screen and read the message. It contained only 2 sentences. "Do not go home. Check the cameras." My chest tightened instantly. My first thought was that there had been a break-in. Franklin is a safe area, but violent home invasions still happen. Maybe someone had followed me out of the neighborhood and waited for the house to be empty. My protective instincts, honed by decades of managing chaotic and highly dangerous construction sites, kicked in immediately. I did not panic. I calmly activated my turn signal, navigated across 2 lanes of fast-moving traffic, and pulled my truck safely onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. I put the hazard lights on, put the engine in park, and took a deep, steadying breath. I opened my smart home security app. I fully expected to see a shattered window or masked strangers ransacking Catherine's beautiful sunroom. The app buffered for a few agonizing seconds. The little loading circle spun round and round, mocking my rising anxiety. Finally, the high-definition live video feed from the front hallway snapped onto my screen. I stared at the image, utterly paralyzed. My brain refused to process the information flowing into my eyes. There was no shattered glass. There were no masked burglars. Walking through my front door looking completely relaxed and entirely in charge was Bradley, my own son. The same man I had just hugged goodbye at the airport departure curb less than 45 minutes ago. He was not rushing. He was not looking for a forgotten passport. He was strolling casually into the foyer with his wife Monica trailing closely behind him. Monica had a smug, calculating smile on her face as she pointed directly toward the primary load-bearing walls of my living room. My hands started to shake. Why was he here? Why did he lie to my face about going through airport security? I watched as Bradley set his expensive leather carry-on bag down on the hardwood floor, kicking it aside carelessly. Then the true horror of the situation stepped right into the camera frame. They were not alone. Following closely behind my son and daughter-in-law were three tall men. They were not wearing the casual clothes of friends dropping by for a visit. They were wearing sharp, tailored suits, the exact kind of suits worn by aggressive corporate developers and ruthless bank appraisers. But it was not their expensive clothing that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was what they were carrying in their hands. One of the men unrolled a massive industrial-grade architectural blueprint right on top of my custom mahogany dining table. I have spent my entire life in the commercial construction industry. I know exactly what structural demolition blueprints look like. I know the distinct sharp red lines used to map out major utility shutoffs and critical foundation extractions. The second man placed a heavy-duty steel-handled sledgehammer on the floor next to the blueprints. The third man pulled out a high-tech scanning device, a laser level used specifically to measure the structural integrity of structural beams before a total teardown. They were not looking at my house as a family home. They were evaluating it as a demolition project. I sat alone in my truck on the side of the busy highway, the deafening roar of passing cars completely muted by the intense ringing in my ears. I watched my son, my own flesh and blood, trace his finger over the blueprints, nodding in agreement with the men in suits. He pointed directly at the sunroom, the very room I had built with my own two hands to make his mother smile during her final days. Monica laughed at something one of the men said, clapping her hands together in pure excitement. They thought I was just a clueless old man who had driven away completely oblivious to the world around me. They thought their emotional quarantine had worked flawlessly, that I was too weak and too isolated to understand what was happening right under my nose. But they forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot that long before I was a grieving widower, I was a man who built immense empires from the dirt up. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone in a fit of rage. I watched the screen with a deadly quiet focus as the men picked up their tools and began moving toward the structural pillars of my home. My breathing slowed down. A cold, hard realization settled deep inside my bones. My son was not planning a minor home renovation. He was planning an execution. And if I drove home right now to confront them blindly, I would be walking directly into a trap I could not yet fully see. I kept my eyes fixed on the small glowing screen of my mobile phone. The men in sharp suits were fanning out across my living room like a tactical military unit. I needed to test the waters. I needed to know exactly how deep this deception ran before I made my next move. I minimized the security application, opened my phone keypad, and dialed my son's number. The line rang once. It rang twice. On the third ring, the call connected. My son answered, and instantly, a wave of artificial background noise flooded through the speaker. I could hear the muffled, echoing voice of an automated boarding announcer calling out international gate numbers. I could hear the faint rhythmic sound of rolling luggage wheels clicking against hard tile floors. I could even hear the distant murmur of a crowded terminal. It was a brilliant, flawless audio illusion. Bradley had prepared a fake sound environment to convince me he was sitting at his departure gate, waiting to board a flight across the Atlantic Ocean. "Dad, hey," he said, his voice bright and perfectly casual. "I am just grabbing a quick coffee near my gate before boarding starts." "Did you make it back onto the highway all right?" I forced my vocal cords to relax completely. I took a slow breath and made sure my tone carried absolutely nothing but the mild, harmless confusion of an elderly father. "I am on the highway, Bradley," I said slowly, letting a slight pause linger in the air. But my phone just gave me a very strange notification. The smart home application sent me a motion alert from the front hallway. "It looks like someone is walking around inside the house right now." I heard a soft, practiced chuckle on the other end of the line. It was the laugh of a man who thought he held all the cards, a man completely confident in his own superiority. "Oh, do not worry about that at all, Dad," he replied smoothly, without missing a single beat. "My flight to London actually got delayed until late tonight because of some mechanical issues on the runway. Monica and I decided to head back to your place instead of waiting around the crowded terminal for 10 hours. Those alerts you are seeing on your phone are just from us and the men we brought over to help." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my eyes locked on the live video feed on my screen. One of the contractors was currently swinging a heavy sledgehammer into the drywall near the stone fireplace, sending a cloud of white dust into the air. "Men?" I asked, letting a carefully measured hint of fake anxiety slip into my voice. "What men exactly, Bradley? Why are strangers inside my home while you are supposed to be leaving the country?" My son sighed softly into the receiver. He was playing the role of the endlessly patient, deeply caring child dealing with a paranoid parent. "Dad, listen to me for a second. Monica and I have been really worried about you lately. You live in that big house all alone. There have been several aggressive break-ins reported over in Franklin County this past month. Since I am going to be thousands of miles away in London for a whole week, I wanted to make absolutely sure you were completely safe. Those men are high-end smart home security contractors. I hired them to upgrade your entire alarm system today. They are going to install heavy-duty structural perimeter sensors and advanced thermal motion detectors in every single room. It is a surprise gift from Monica and me. We just want you to be secure in your own home." I watched the screen with a growing sense of absolute disgust. The men in my living room were not carrying any electrical wiring. They were not holding delicate security cameras, motion sensors, or thermal detectors. They were holding heavy demolition tools, pry bars, and architectural blueprints. "That is very thoughtful of you, Bradley," I murmured, keeping the venom entirely out of my voice. "But I really do not need any new alarms. I am perfectly fine with the system I have. I will just turn the truck around and head home now so we can all talk about it together." His tone shifted immediately. The casual warmth vanished, replaced by a subtle, firm, and unyielding pressure. He was gently but firmly backing me into a corner, using my own comfort as a weapon. "No, Dad. Please do not come home right now," he insisted, raising his voice slightly to project an air of genuine concern. "The contractors are going to be doing some serious core drilling in the walls to run the new sensor cables. It is going to be incredibly loud, dusty, and completely chaotic for the next 48 hours. You know exactly how much you hate construction noise. It will just trigger your migraines and ruin your entire week. Why do you not do yourself a massive favor and drive up to the lake cabin for the weekend instead? The weather is supposed to be absolutely beautiful out there. You can relax on the quiet porch, go fishing, read a good book, and get some fresh air. Just let me handle all of this heavy lifting for you. You have worked hard your entire life building things for us. Let your son take care of you for once." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer audacity of his lies wash over me. The depth of his psychological manipulation was truly staggering. He was weaponizing my age, my desire for peace, and my fundamental trust in him to clear me off the property. He needed the house empty to execute whatever devastating plan he had set in motion. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, son," I said softly, playing the role of the weary, compliant old man. "I think I will take your advice and head up to the lake right now. I will let you handle the house." "I love you, Bradley." "I love you too, Dad," he replied, sounding profoundly relieved that I had taken the bait so easily. "Have a great weekend on the water." I ended the call. The silence inside my parked truck was deafening, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the rushing traffic outside. I opened the security application and zoomed in on the high-definition video feed. I needed to see exactly what they were doing to the sunroom, the beautiful light-filled space Catherine and I had designed together. The men were now setting up a tall tripod-mounted device dead in the center of the hardwood floor. It was absolutely not a security sensor. It was a commercial light detection and ranging scanner. It was a specialized three-dimensional laser mapping tool used by structural engineers to measure load-bearing foundations right before a total property demolition. They were actively targeting the heavy steel support beams I had laid with my own hands. My heart grew completely cold. I stared at the glowing screen of my mobile phone, my mind racing through 4 decades of intensive commercial development experience. You absolutely do not use a commercial light detection and ranging scanner to install simple motion sensors or a standard burglar alarm. A highly specialized piece of equipment like that maps the intricate structural integrity of a building. It calculates the exact location of load-bearing walls, pinpoints foundational weak points, and analyzes the core support beams. It creates a flawless digital blueprint for one specific devastating purpose: complete demolition. They were actively measuring the structural limits of my house to tear it down to the dirt. The horrific realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, driving the breath from my lungs. Why would my son want to maliciously bulldoze the beautiful home I built with my own hands for his mother? Before I could process the agonizing depth of this betrayal, the live video feed on my phone screen shuddered violently. The high-definition image of the men standing in my living room, pixelated into a messy scramble of distorted, vibrant colors. Then the screen went completely black. A small white spinning circle appeared in the direct center of the dark display, rotating endlessly for several seconds, followed by a stark red error message flashing across the top. Connection was lost. I quickly tapped the screen with my thumb, frantically trying to refresh the application. Nothing else happened at all. I navigated to the backyard camera view. Connection lost. I checked the driveway camera, the garage camera, and the side door camera. Every single visual feed was entirely dead. Bradley had not just covered the camera lenses with a towel or some tape. He had gone straight into the basement utility room and physically severed the main internet connection to the entire property. I was purposely plunging the house into a complete digital blackout so he could operate entirely in the dark, hidden from my view. My breathing grew incredibly shallow and rapid inside the stifling, sun-baked hot cabin of my heavy-duty truck. If Bradley was willing to boldly lie about his international flight, bring a professional demolition crew right into my living room, and permanently sever my security feeds, what else had he already done behind my back? I immediately thought of Maria. As my dedicated housekeeper for the past 10 years, she was scheduled to be at the house every single weekday, from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. She should have been right there in the kitchen when Bradley arrived with his unexpected guests. She would never silently allow strangers carrying massive sledgehammers and architectural blueprints into the living room without calling my personal cell phone first. She was fiercely protective of the entire property, treating every single room as if it were her own cherished home. I hastily closed the dead security application and quickly dialed her mobile number. I pressed the phone tightly against my ear, desperate to hear her familiar, comforting voice on the other end of the line. I desperately needed her to tell me exactly what was happening inside those walls while I was trapped out here on the highway. Instead of the normal rhythmic ringing tone, I was suddenly greeted by a sharp, piercing electronic beep that made me wince. Then a cold, unfeeling automated female voice filled the small speaker. "We are sorry, but the number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." I pulled the phone slowly away from my face and stared down at the blank screen in pure, unfiltered disbelief. Disconnected. I had just spoken to Maria yesterday afternoon while sitting on the porch. We had casually discussed the grocery list for the upcoming week and the cleaning supplies we needed to buy. Her monthly phone bill was paid automatically through my secure business account without fail. There was absolutely no logical reason whatsoever for her number to be suddenly out of service. I dialed the digits again, praying silently that I had simply hit the wrong button in my haste. The exact same sharp beep sounded, followed instantly by the exact same automated soulless message. My stomach twisted violently into a tight, agonizing knot. Bradley had not just cut the internet cable to the house. He had somehow maliciously cut my communication with the one person who could tell me the absolute truth. He was systematically isolating me, severing every single thread that connected me to my own life. I sat motionless in the heavy silence of my truck, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white from the intense pressure. A profound sense of absolute isolation washed over my entire body. I was firmly locked out of my own home, totally blinded by the sudden security blackout, and completely cut off from my most trusted ally in the entire world. The carefully constructed narrative of a loving son eagerly upgrading a home security system for his elderly father had entirely collapsed, leaving behind a terrifying gaping void of completely unanswered questions. I desperately needed information, and I needed it immediately. Just as I was about to start the engine and risk driving straight back to the property to confront them face to face, my phone vibrated sharply in the palm of my hand. It was not a phone call. It was a simple text message notification. I looked down at the bright screen. The cryptic text message was from an unknown local phone number that I absolutely did not recognize at all. I carefully swiped the digital notification to open the text, my tired eyes slowly scanning the small black letters arranged perfectly against the bright white background of the messaging application. The chilling words I read made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. "Hello, Mr. Rick. It is Sophia, Maria's daughter. Please do not call this number back under any circumstances. I am using a trusted friend's phone because we are absolutely terrified right now. Bradley fired my mom roughly an hour ago. He showed up unannounced with 3 strange men and told her to pack her things immediately. He aggressively threw 3 months of cash pay at her and forced her to sign a strict, legally binding, non-disclosure agreement. He yelled right in her face and threatened to call immigration and report our entire family to the authorities if she ever tries to contact you again. My mom is crying uncontrollably and shaking in her bedroom. She honestly does not understand what is currently happening to the house. We are going to stay hidden at my aunt's house until things calm down completely. I am so incredibly sorry we cannot help you right now, but please listen to me carefully." Before my mom was forcefully pushed out the front door, she heard Bradley talking quietly to those men in the suits. He told them not to worry about the noise or the massive mess they were making. He told them you are completely losing your mind and that he is permanently moving you into a secure, locked psychiatric asylum tomorrow morning without fail. Losing my mind. Moving me to a locked psychiatric asylum. The words on the small screen blurred together as my heart slammed against my ribs. I read the text message a second time, and then a third time, praying I had misunderstood Sophia's frantic warning. But the stark reality of the situation crashed down upon me with the crushing weight of a collapsing concrete wall. My own son was not just planning to demolish the house I built. I was actively plotting to erase my entire existence as a free, independent human being. He wanted to strip away my basic human rights, declare me mentally incompetent, and lock me away in a sterile white room so he could operate with absolute impunity. A cold, terrifying realization suddenly washed over me. Bradley knew exactly where I was. 2 years ago, under the guise of wanting to make sure I was safe while driving alone, he had insisted we link our mobile devices through a family location sharing application. At the time, I thought it was incredibly thoughtful. Now I understood it was a digital leash. If I drove my truck straight to the lake cabin like I promised, he would track my exact route and spring his trap perfectly. If I drove back to the house, I would be walking blindly into a coordinated ambush with no legal protection and no concrete proof of his true intentions. I needed to disappear immediately. I put the truck in drive and pulled back onto the busy highway, but I did not head toward the quiet lake. Instead, I drove directly into the heart of the most crowded shopping mall on the southern edge of Nashville. I navigated through the massive sea of vehicles until I found a spot in a dense multi-level parking garage. I took my expensive smartphone, turned the volume all the way down, and shoved it deep into the locked glove compartment of my truck. As far as Bradley's tracking application was concerned, his elderly compliant father had simply stopped to grab some lunch or run a harmless errand on his way out of town. I walked out of the parking garage and walked 3 blocks down the street to a small rundown convenience store. I used crumpled cash to buy a cheap prepaid mobile phone and a simple phone card. I was completely off the grid, a ghost in my own city. I walked another mile until I found a heavily weathered roadside motel that still advertised hourly rates on a fading neon sign. It was the exact kind of place that only accepted cash and never asked to see a formal identification card. I paid the tired clerk behind the reinforced glass window for 2 nights and walked to room number 12. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of stale smoke and harsh chemical cleaners. The floral bedspread was thin and heavily faded, and a single, flickering bulb illuminated the small, cramped space. It was a massive departure from my beautiful custom-built estate, but right now this cheap motel room was the safest place in the entire world. I sat heavily on the edge of the sagging mattress, resting my face in my rough, calloused hands. The deafening silence of the motel room allowed the agonizing memories of the past 4 years to finally surface. After my beloved wife, Catherine, passed away, the grief had nearly destroyed me. Bradley and Monica had stepped in immediately. They started filtering my phone calls, telling my oldest friends from the construction industry that I was simply too exhausted and too overwhelmed to attend our regular golf games or our monthly poker nights. When my former business partners tried to invite me out for dinner, Monica would intercept them, gently explaining that I was struggling with my memory and needed absolute quiet to properly mourn. They slowly, methodically severed every single social tie I had cultivated over 40 years in the infrastructure business. I had accepted their intervention at the time because the pain of losing Catherine made everything else feel incredibly heavy and utterly meaningless. I honestly believed they were shielding me from a fast-paced world I was no longer ready to face. I believed they were wrapping me in a warm blanket of familial love and fierce protection. Sitting in the dim light of the motel room, the horrifying truth finally pierced through the comforting lies. It was never a protective blanket. It was a carefully constructed quarantine. They were actively building a narrative of a frail, grieving, and increasingly confused old man. They were laying the psychological groundwork for my eventual institutionalization, ensuring that when the day finally came to declare me legally incompetent, absolutely no one in my old social circle would question the sudden decision. My friends would just nod sadly and agree that Bradley was doing the right thing for his poor, deteriorating father. A fierce, burning anger began to replace the initial shock and the suffocating betrayal. I was not some helpless, feeble old man waiting quietly for the end. I was Richard Alden. I had spent 4 decades negotiating with ruthless land developers, battling aggressive city zoning boards, and managing thousands of tough, unyielding construction workers. I knew how to build impenetrable fortresses, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to dismantle them. But to fight back effectively, I needed absolute proof of their plan. I needed to know the exact details of what they were doing inside my house, who those men in the sharp suits truly represented, and what their ultimate endgame was. The problem was the digital blackout. Bradley had expertly severed the main internet connection, effectively blinding me by disabling every single high-definition camera on the property. I stood up and began to pace the short length of the motel room, my mind actively searching for any possible architectural vulnerability I could exploit. I thought about the layout of my home, tracing the invisible lines of the electrical grid in my head. Bradley was a creature of the modern digital age. He understood wireless networks, cloud storage, and complex smart home applications. But he was profoundly arrogant, and his arrogance made him completely blind to anything that did not require a wireless internet connection. I suddenly stopped pacing as a very specific memory from 10 years ago flashed vividly into my mind. Long before smart homes were a trend, I had purchased a beautiful, towering, antique grandfather clock for my private study. Catherine had loved the deep, resonant chime it made every hour. What Bradley never knew, what no one in the world knew except me, was that I had customized the hollow wooden cavity inside the base of that clock. I had securely installed a heavy-duty battery-operated analog dictaphone wired to a voice-activated microphone. It was completely independent of the house electricity and totally invisible to any digital network scan. If those men were talking in my study, the grandfather clock was actively recording every single word they said. I just needed to find a way to retrieve that audio without getting caught tonight. The clock on the dashboard of my ride-share vehicle glowed a harsh green in the darkness. It was exactly 2 a.m. I asked the driver to drop me off at a quiet gas station about a mile away from my actual property line. I paid him in cash, waited for his taillights to disappear, and began the long walk down the dark, winding country road. The night air was thick with the familiar scent of damp pine. I pulled my jacket collar up against the chill, keeping my head down. Every step brought me closer to the home I spent my adult life building, now occupied by my son like a hostile invader. When the stone columns of my entrance emerged from the shadows, I slipped behind a massive oak tree. I could see the soft blue glow of the new security keypad Bradley had installed that very afternoon. He had completely locked me out. He thought changing a simple access code was enough to keep an old man at bay. But Bradley only saw the absolute surface of things. He never understood the bones of a structure. I designed every inch of that 10-acre perimeter. I knew that 50 yards left of the gate, hidden behind dense blackberry bushes, a specific section of wrought iron fencing had shifted due to soil erosion. I noticed the flaw 3 years ago but never fixed it. I moved quietly through the tangled brush, feeling sharp thorns tearing at my sleeves. I reached the compromised section of the heavy fence and knelt down in the wet dirt. I gripped the iron bars, took a steadying breath, and pulled upward with all the strength left in my 71-year-old shoulders. The iron gave way just enough, creating a narrow gap at the bottom. I slid my body through the muddy opening, pulling myself onto my own estate like a trespasser. My joints ached fiercely, and my lungs burned from the intense exertion, but the furious pounding adrenaline completely masked the physical pain. I was officially inside the dark, secure perimeter now. The massive 2-story house stood before me like a dark, silent fortress against the starless night sky. There were absolutely no exterior lights on, and the windows were completely black. I stayed extremely low to the ground, using the deep shadows cast by the tall oak trees to securely cover my steady approach. I navigated the familiar garden pathways purely by memory, silently avoiding the loose paving stones and the hidden metal sprinkler heads that would easily trip a careless intruder. Every rustle of the wind through the leaves sent a fresh spike of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The estate, once a place of profound comfort, now felt aggressively hostile, as if the very walls had turned a blind eye to their true owner. I paused near the edge of Catherine's rose garden, the sweet faint scent of the dormant blooms briefly cutting through the damp chill. It was a stark reminder of what I was fighting for. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about protecting the sacred history we had built together, brick by brick. I watched a security patrol vehicle cruise slowly down the main road, its headlights sweeping across the front gates. I held my breath, pressing myself against the rough bark of an old elm tree until the vehicle's taillights faded into the distance. Moving with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, I finally reached the large floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my private study. I pressed my back hard against the damp brick wall, shivering slightly as the cold moisture seeped through my dark clothing. I reached into my deep jacket pocket and pulled out a small specialized wireless receiver that I had kept securely hidden in my old tool bag for over a decade. The device was a custom-built local receiver designed to sync directly with the closed-loop transmission system I had secretly wired into the hollow base of my antique grandfather clock. It was completely independent of the main internet router Bradley had maliciously severed. I held my breath, pressed the small power button on the side of the receiver, and watched the tiny screen light up in the darkness. It immediately began searching for the hidden local server broadcasting from just on the other side of the thick glass window. The screen displayed a small, spinning icon. 10 agonizing seconds passed in absolute silence. Then a solid green connection light flashed brightly. I successfully breached the internal audio feed. I pressed the download command to pull the locally stored voice recordings from the past 12 hours directly onto my device. A thin progress bar appeared on the illuminated screen. 10%. 20%. The file was containing hours of continuous conversation from the moment my son and his demolition crew had stepped foot into my private study. 30%. 40%. I crouched lower into the damp soil, my eyes darting nervously around the dark perimeter of the property to make absolutely sure no one was patrolling the grounds. 50%. 60%. The download felt agonizingly slow. I gripped the small plastic receiver so tightly my fingers began to cramp. 70%. 80%. I could feel the intense nervous sweat gathering on my forehead despite the freezing night air. I just needed a few more seconds to secure the undeniable proof of their betrayal. 90%. Suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, the interior lights of the study flicked on, illuminating the grass around me in a brilliant, blinding wash of yellow light. I dropped flat into the cold dirt, pressing my face directly into the wet mud, burying the glowing screen of the receiver beneath my chest, so the light would not give away my position. My heart stopped beating. I held my breath entirely perfectly still, listening intently to the sudden movement inside the room, just inches away from my hiding spot. I heard the heavy latch of the glass window click loudly. Then, the distinct sound of the heavy glass pane sliding open on its metal track pierced the quiet night. A strong wave of warm, conditioned air washed over my freezing shoulders, followed immediately by the sharp, bitter smell of burning tobacco. Monica was standing right above me, leaning casually out of the open window to smoke a cigarette in the cool night air. If she simply looked straight down, she would see me lying in the mud like a hunted animal. I remained completely frozen, my eyes squeezed tightly shut, silently, praying to a God I had not spoken to in years. Then I heard her voice. She was not talking to Bradley. She was speaking quietly into her cellular phone to an unknown man on the other end of the line. Her tone was cold, calculating, and dripping with absolute confidence. "You really do not need to worry about the structural timeline at all," she said smoothly, taking a long drag from her cigarette. "I am telling you, the heavy demolition permit is already completely cleared for Friday morning. The massive excavators are fully booked and ready to roll. Just make sure the offshore wire transfers are totally prepared on your end. As soon as the walls come down, we will have the insurance money and the clean commercial lot ready for the final sale." She paused for a few seconds, listening to the man speaking on the phone. She laughed softly, a cruel, mocking sound that sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. "I know it sounds a little ruthless," she continued, blowing a long stream of smoke out into the darkness. "But Bradley finally handled his stubborn father. The old man will be permanently out of our way before the weekend even begins. Beneath my chest, pressed hard into the wet earth, the small receiver vibrated once in complete silence. The digital progress bar had finally hit 99%, 100%. The tiny screen on my receiver flashed a solid green light, indicating the audio file transfer was completely successful. I quickly pressed the power button, plunging the device into total darkness, and shoved it deep into my soaked jacket pocket. Above me, the window slid shut with a sharp thud. The heavy latch clicked into place and the interior blinds were drawn closed. I waited in the freezing mud for 10 agonizing minutes, completely paralyzed, listening to the frantic beating of my own heart. When I was absolutely certain the perimeter was clear, I crawled backward through the wet grass, retracing my exact path. I squeezed my aching body back through the narrow gap in the wrought iron fence, leaving my beautiful property behind like a fugitive in the night. I walked the long, dark mile back to the gas station, shivering uncontrollably from the biting wind and the damp soil clinging to my clothes. I used my burner phone to call another ride-share vehicle. The driver did not say a word about my disheveled appearance. He dropped me off at the edge of the cheap motel, and I walked the rest of the way to room number 12. Once I was safely bolted inside the cramped, faintly smelling motel room, I immediately stripped off my ruined jacket and washed the mud from my trembling hands in the stained bathroom sink. I did not care about the cold or the exhaustion radiating through my old bones. I needed to hear exactly what was buried inside that audio file. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, turned on the single bedside lamp, and pulled out my receiver. I connected a pair of cheap wired earphones I had purchased at the convenience store earlier that afternoon. I pressed the small plastic buds into my ears, took a deep shuddering breath, and pressed the play button. The audio quality was terrifyingly crisp. The customized microphone I had hidden inside the hollow wooden base of the antique grandfather clock picked up every single ambient sound in the study with absolute clarity. I could hear the heavy wooden doors swinging open. I heard the heavy rhythmic thud of work boots stepping onto the polished hardwood floors. Then I heard the sound of my loyal housekeeper, Maria, crying softly. Bradley was speaking to her in a tone I had never heard him use before. It was vicious, demeaning, and dripping with an unearned, arrogant authority. I listened as my own son threw cash onto the desk, aggressively demanding she sign the non-disclosure agreement. I heard the horrific threats he made against her family, weaponizing their immigration status to enforce her complete silence. My chest physically ached listening to Maria sob as she was forcefully escorted out the front door. She had treated Bradley with nothing but kindness for a decade, and he discarded her like absolute garbage after the heavy front door slammed shut. The recording fell quiet for a few brief moments. Then the heavy footsteps returned to my private study. I recognized the deep, gruff voices of the men in the suits. They were unfolding large sheets of paper across my desk. I heard the sharp, distinct sound of a tape measure snapping right back into its plastic casing. One of the contractors cleared his throat, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. He sounded genuinely impressed, almost hesitant about the job they had been hired to do. "This foundation is built like a fortress," the contractor said, tapping a heavy pen against the desk. "We just ran the laser scans across the primary support beams. Your father did not cut a single corner when he poured this concrete. The structural integrity is flawless. Honestly, it is a damn shame to tear down a $1.2 million custom build like this. You could easily sell this house for a massive premium without knocking down a single wall. Why destroy a perfectly good mansion?" I held my breath, just waiting for my son to respond. I thought maybe, just maybe, hearing a professional validate the immense value and craftsmanship of his childhood home would trigger a shred of hesitation in his heart. Instead, Bradley let out a cold, humorless laugh that sounded utterly devoid of any human emotion. I was speaking about my masterpiece, the sanctuary I had painstakingly designed to comfort his dying mother, with absolute chilling indifference. "I do not care about the wood," Bradley replied flatly. his voice echoing through my earphones. I do not care about the custom brickwork, the imported windows, or the sentimental value of those perfectly poured concrete pillars. You can smash it all into dust and haul it away in dumpsters for all I care. The house is completely worthless to me. I only care about the dirt underneath it. My hands curled into tight, trembling fists on my lap. The sheer calculating cruelty in his voice was devastating. He was not acting out of financial desperation or sudden panic. This was a methodical, premeditated assassination of my legacy. The audio recording captured the loud rustling of heavy architectural blueprints being quickly rolled up and forcefully shoved into their protective carrying tubes by the 3 men standing in my private study. The contractors asked me about the strict demolition timeline, confirming that their massive excavators and heavy wrecking crews were fully prepared to mobilize immediately. They warned him that tearing down a luxury house of this massive scale would draw immediate attention from the nosy neighbors and local authorities. They desperately needed to know if the legal permits and the complex property ownership transfers were completely ironclad before they started swinging the wrecking balls. Before Bradley could even answer the anxious men, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive high heels echoed on the polished hardwood floor. Monica had finally entered the study. Her voice sliced right through the digital recording, dripping with a venomous confidence that made my blood run absolutely cold. She was the true architect of this immense misery. "You do not need to worry about any legal interference from my old father-in-law," she told the nervous contractors smoothly. "We have already taken care of all the necessary paperwork, and we are managing his sudden, tragic mental decline very closely." I stared blankly at the peeling wallpaper of the cheap motel room, my breathing practically stopping inside my aching chest. My own daughter-in-law was casually discussing my impending social demise without a single shred of human guilt. The audio recording continued to play, capturing the exact horrifying words that would permanently shatter the entire foundation of my world. "The official demolition permit is fully cleared for early Friday morning," Monica continued, her tone casually dismissive, as if she were ordering a simple cup of coffee. "We are leaving for a luxury hotel downtown right now to establish our perfect alibi, and the clueless old man is safely out of the way for the night. As long as he is legally locked inside the secure psychiatric ward by Friday morning, the $12 million commercial rezoning deal is completely and entirely ours. $12 million. A psychiatric ward." The recorded words of my daughter-in-law hung in the stale air of the motel room, echoing in my mind like a cracked bell. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the sagging mattress, the plastic earbuds pressed firmly into my ears. A lesser man might have screamed. A weaker father might have thrown the receiver against the wall or collapsed onto the floor in a fit of tears. But I did not scream, and I most certainly did not shed a single cry. The initial shock of the betrayal, the sharp pain of realizing my own flesh and blood viewed me as a disposable obstacle rapidly calcified into something entirely different. It quickly hardened into a cold, absolute, and purely strategic focus. I had successfully spent 40 long years in the brutal, unforgiving world of commercial infrastructure development. I had negotiated with city zoning boards, fought off hostile corporate takeovers, and survived economic downturns that crushed lesser contractors into dust. You do not survive 4 decades in that industry by panicking when a demolition ball swings your way. You survive by analyzing the trajectory, finding the structural weakness of your opponent, and dismantling their machinery before they can even strike the first blow. My son had spent his life watching me build things, but he never paid attention to how fiercely I defended the foundations I laid. I pulled the earphones out, set the receiver on the bedside table, and looked at the glowing red numbers on the digital alarm clock. It was just past 4 o'clock in the morning. I had exactly 4 days until Friday. 4 full days to systematically dismantle a vicious trap that had likely taken them many months to construct. I waited in the stifling silence of the room until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the gaps in the thin curtains. As soon as the sun crested the horizon, I picked up the cheap burner phone I had purchased the day before. I did not need to look up the phone number I was about to dial. It was permanently etched into my memory. I dialed the private direct line of Harrison Blake. Harrison was a ruthless old-school corporate attorney. We went back nearly 30 years. When he was just a young lawyer trying to open his independent practice, he uncovered a massive municipal bribery scheme that threatened to ruin my commercial project. Instead of taking a payout from corrupt city officials to look the other way, Harrison brought the evidence directly to me. I backed him, financially funded his legal battle against the city, and we won a landmark case that completely cemented both of our careers. He owed me his professional life, and I trusted him with my actual life. The line rang twice before his deep, gravelly voice answered. He was a man who rarely slept, always working on complex legal maneuvering. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him it was Rick, that I was using a secure, untraceable line, and that I was currently facing a catastrophic, coordinated hostile takeover of my entire estate by my own son. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by the familiar sound of a leather briefcase snapping shut. Harrison did not ask a single unnecessary question. He simply asked for a location. I gave him the address of an old, sterile diner situated on the industrial outskirts of the county, far away from the upscale neighborhoods where Bradley operated. I arrived at the diner 30 minutes later. The place smelled of burnt coffee and bleach. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far back corner facing the entrance. Harrison walked through the glass doors a few moments later. He wore a tailored navy suit, carrying his battered leather briefcase with an air of authority. He slid into the booth across from me, his sharp eyes scanning my wrinkled clothes and exhausted face. I did not offer a lengthy explanation. I simply placed the digital receiver on the sticky laminate table, handed him the cheap earphones, and pressed play. I watched his face intently as the audio recording of Bradley and Monica filled his ears. Harrison had seen the absolute worst of human nature during his long decades in corporate litigation. But his stoic features tightened with genuine disgust as he quietly listened to Monica casually detail my impending institutionalization. When the recording finally clicked off, he slowly pulled the earphones out and placed them neatly on the table. He looked at me with a dangerous, calculating glint in his eyes. $12 million for a commercial rezoning deal, he murmured quietly, tapping his index finger against the table. The city council must have quietly pushed through the new commercial district expansion right up to your property line. That kind of sudden zoning shift turns a luxury residential home into a prime commercial goldmine overnight. But they cannot legally touch that land, authorize a demolition, or secure a commercial loan of that massive scale without your explicit notarized signature, Rick. You own that estate outright. There is no mortgage. There are no liens. I nodded slowly, leaning forward. That is exactly why they are trying to lock me inside a psychiatric ward by Friday, I explained, keeping my voice low so the lone waitress wiping down the counter across the room would not hear. If I am declared mentally incompetent, Bradley becomes my legal guardian. He gets the land, he gets the money, and I disappear into a locked room for the rest of my life. Harrison grabbed his phone from his pocket, his jaw set in a hard line. He told me to stay put and drink my coffee. He walked outside into the morning air to make highly confidential calls. I watched him pace back and forth across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot for nearly 45 minutes. I saw him making aggressive gestures with his free hand, leveraging every ounce of his immense legal power, calling in favors from county clerks, aggressively accessing sealed zoning records, and digging deeply into recent court filings. The hot coffee in my mug grew completely cold, but I did not take a single sip. I just watched my attorney dismantle the invisible walls my son had built around me. Finally, the glass door of the diner swung open. Harrison walked back inside, but the confident, aggressive stride he possessed earlier was entirely gone. His face was unusually pale, and his posture was rigid with suppressed anger. He slid back into the booth, placing his phone face down on the laminate table. He took a long, heavy breath and looked me directly in the eyes with an expression of profound, terrifying gravity. "Rick," he said, his voice dropping to a barely audible, strained whisper. "3 days ago, a county judge quietly approved an emergency power of attorney giving Bradley total, undisputed control of your entire estate. The legal filing includes a comprehensive medical diagnosis signed by a private physician officially claiming you have late-stage aggressive Alzheimer's." The terrible words hung in the freezing air between us like a physical weight. Late-stage aggressive Alzheimer disease. I sat frozen in the cracked vinyl booth of the diner, staring at the scarred laminate table as my attorney's horrifying revelation washed over me. I was legally, and my basic human rights had been completely stripped away. Bradley had not simply stolen my valuable property. He had stolen my identity. If I walked out into the street right now and tried to access my own bank accounts, I would be denied. If I tried to call the police to report a home invasion, my son would simply show them the court order and shake his head with fake, sorrowful tears. He would tell the officers that his poor, confused father was having another severe dementia episode. They would pat him on the back for being such a dedicated caregiver, and then they would escort me straight to a locked psychiatric ward. I felt a sudden, suffocating wave of nausea rise in my chest. I closed my eyes and took a very long, deep breath, forcefully willing my racing mind to remain absolutely cold and completely focused. I looked up at Harrison. His calm face was now a tight mask of pure professional fury. He had spent his entire career fighting ruthless corporate sharks, but this intimate level of familial betrayal sickened even him. "We cannot simply walk into a courtroom and contest this right now," Harrison said quietly, leaning closer across the table. "If we file an emergency injunction, the legal process will take weeks to schedule a hearing. By that time, your house will be demolished, and the commercial land sale will be finalized. Bradley will have the money, and he will disappear. We need to find out exactly what he is doing with your assets right this very second." Harrison pulled out his phone and made another brief, hushed call. Within 30 minutes, a tall, thin man wearing a wrinkled gray suit walked into the diner. Harrison introduced him as Thomas, a highly specialized forensic auditor who worked exclusively on complex corporate embezzlement cases. Thomas did not ask for pleasantries. He opened a thick laptop, connected it to a secure mobile hotspot, and immediately went to work. Harrison provided him with all of my personal identification numbers, my business tax records, and the commercial parcel details of my estate. For the next 2 hours, the only sound at our table was the rapid, rhythmic clicking of the auditor's keyboard. I sat in absolute silence, drinking glass after glass of freezing ice water, quietly watching the glowing screen reflect directly in Thomas's glasses. He was diving deep into the encrypted financial networks, tracing the invisible digital footprints my son had left behind. Bradley thought he was a technological genius, but he was leaving a trail of arrogance. Suddenly, Thomas completely stopped typing. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and turned the laptop screen toward Harrison and me. He slowly pointed to a highlighted line of text buried deep within a massive spreadsheet of county property records. "Bradley did not just secure a demolition permit," Thomas said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "He has already fully leveraged the newly rezoned commercial value of your entire property. He forged your signature on a digital commercial promissory note." I leaned forward, squinting at the complex financial document displayed on the screen. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked, dreading the answer. "It means he took out a massive high-interest bridge loan against the future sale of your land." Harrison explained, his jaw clenching with anger. "Because the property is now zoned for a multi-million-dollar commercial development, a predatory private lending firm approved a massive cash advance based on the impending demolition and clearing of the lot. They approved a loan for $3 million. And the worst part is the funds were fully approved and wired out of the escrow account yesterday afternoon." My chest tightened painfully. $3 million. My son had effectively mortgaged the ground beneath my feet, while I was completely oblivious. He had stolen an astronomical sum of money using my life's work as collateral. If the demolition went and the commercial sale was finalized, the private lenders would simply take their massive cut from the profits. If the sale somehow failed, the lenders would immediately foreclose on my property and take everything I owned to cover the massive fraudulent debt. Bradley had engineered a situation where he could walk away with millions of dollars in untraceable cash while leaving me completely destitute and locked inside a mental institution. It was a perfectly designed financial execution. Where exactly did that $3 million go? I asked, my voice barely more than a tight whisper. Thomas began typing rapidly again, his fingers flying across the keys as he chased the massive wire transfer through a labyrinth of shell companies and temporary holding accounts. Bradley had tried to obfuscate the final destination, bouncing the money through 3 different domestic banks in less than 12 hours. But Thomas was relentless. He finally breached the last layer of financial misdirection. The money did not go to a bank account in London, Thomas said, his eyes scanning the final transaction record. The entire $3 million was wired directly into an offshore cryptocurrency exchange account registered in the Cayman Islands. I stared at the screen in complete confusion. I knew Bradley dabbled in technology investments, but a massive offshore crypto account made absolutely no logical sense for a simple real estate scam. Harrison leaned over the laptop, reading the name attached to the foreign holding account. His face drained of color for the second time that morning. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "Rick," he said, his voice trembling slightly with the sheer magnitude of the discovery. "This offshore account does not belong to Bradley. It belongs to Monica's younger brother." Harrison quickly pulled up a federal database on his own phone and showed it to me. The screen displayed a breaking news press release from the Department of Justice. Monica's brother was currently facing a massive, unsealed federal indictment from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He had been operating a massive digital Ponzi scheme and owed millions of dollars in stolen investor funds. The federal government was preparing to permanently seize every single asset his entire family owned by the end of the month. This was never just about greedy children wanting an early inheritance to fund a lavish lifestyle. They were incredibly desperate. They were deeply backed into a terrifying legal corner of their own making. Bradley and Monica were desperately trying to use my estate, my cherished home, and my entire life to secretly cover a massive federal felony before the government could seize Monica's family assets and send her brother to a federal penitentiary. The level of sheer, unadulterated evil required to sacrifice a parent to save a criminal sibling was something I could barely comprehend. I sat in the diner, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, as the sheer magnitude of their desperation settled over me. They were not just greedy. They were cornered animals. Thomas, the forensic auditor, did not pause to let us absorb the shock. His fingers continued their relentless dance across the keyboard. "If your son used his own personal information to secure that fraudulent $3 million commercial loan," Thomas said, keeping his eyes locked on his monitor, "then he must have left a digital footprint regarding his current physical location. He cannot be on a flight to London. He needs to remain local to oversee the demolition and ensure the offshore wire transfer clears the international banking regulations before the federal government freezes his brother-in-law's assets." Thomas opened a new secure window and cross-referenced the IP address used to authorize the final loan documents earlier that morning. It took him less than 5 minutes to pierce through a standard virtual private network. He rotated the laptop screen toward me once again. A detailed map of downtown Nashville appeared with a bright red marker blinking steadily over one of the most expensive high-security luxury hotels in the entire city. "Your son never went anywhere near an international departure gate," Thomas explained smoothly. "He checked into the luxury penthouse suite of this downtown hotel exactly 2 hours after you dropped him off at the airport terminal. He used a prepaid corporate card registered to Monica's family business, but the internet protocol address matches his personal mobile device. He is intentionally hiding in plain sight. I stared at the blinking red dot on the digital map. The dark pieces of their highly intricate puzzle were finally snapping together with sickening precision. Bradley was creating a flawless, verifiable alibi. By officially checking in for a flight and then quietly retreating to a secluded hotel room, he was establishing a heavily documented paper trail proving he was supposedly thousands of miles away from my property during the crucial window of time. Harrison leaned back in the creaking vinyl booth, vigorously rubbing his temples with his thumb and forefinger. "He is setting up a catastrophic contractor error," my attorney said, his voice laced with dark realization. "Rick, they cannot simply bulldoze a perfectly sound $1.2 million residential estate without raising massive legal red flags with the county zoning commission. If they just tear it down, the insurance company will launch an immediate, exhaustive fraud investigation. They need a perfect tragedy." I looked at Harrison, the horrifying picture becoming completely clear in my mind. "They are going to frame the demolition crew," I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine. Harrison nodded slowly. "Exactly. They hired those men under the guise of an extensive security renovation. Bradley will claim he was abroad on business. He will say the contractors made a catastrophic negligent mistake regarding the load-bearing foundation during their drilling, causing a sudden, irreparable structural collapse of the entire property. The narrative is absolutely flawless. Bradley and Monica will play the role of the devastated, heartbroken homeowners who lost everything due to a negligent construction crew. They will aggressively sue the demolition company's liability insurance for the full replacement value of the luxury home, collecting another massive payout. And the most brilliant part of their sick plan is the aftermath. Once the house is completely reduced to rubble and the debris is cleared away by the city, they are left with exactly what they wanted all along. A perfectly empty, highly desirable $12 million commercial lot ready for immediate development. They pay off the $3 million fraudulent crypto debt to save Monica's brother from federal prison pocket, the massive insurance payout, and walk away as multimillionaires without a single drop of blood on their hands. The sheer meticulous brilliance of their financial scheme was genuinely terrifying, but it still possessed one glaring, fatal flaw. They could completely destroy my home, but the underlying land still legally belonged to me. A forged power of attorney would not hold up against a sane, living property owner standing in a courtroom. I looked directly at Harrison. "But how do they permanently silence me?" I asked. "If I show up on Friday morning and see bulldozers on my front lawn, I will immediately call the police. I will tell the authorities I never authorized a loan or a demolition. Their entire plan completely crumbles the very second I open my mouth to defend myself." Harrison did not answer right away. He pulled his mobile phone from his jacket pocket and opened a highly secure encrypted email application. While Thomas was tracing the financial wires, Harrison had instructed his private paralegal team to dig into the local medical court filings, utilizing the specific judge who had granted Bradley the fraudulent power of attorney. He tapped the screen a few times and then slid the phone slowly across the laminate table toward me. His hand was visibly trembling. "Read this very carefully," Rick Harrison said, his voice thick with a dark, suppressed fury. "This was filed with the County Health Board late yesterday afternoon. It is sealed from public view, but we managed to pull a copy through a judicial backdoor." I looked down at the bright screen. It was a formal, heavily stamped medical and legal document. Specifically, it was an authorized 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold, commonly known as a 5150. The document was completely filled out, stamped with a county seal, and signed by a private, highly expensive concierge doctor who specialized in severe geriatric cognitive decline. The medical narrative detailed on the paperwork was an absolute masterpiece of psychological fiction. The corrupt physician claimed to have evaluated me at my home earlier in the week. The report falsely stated I was suffering from aggressive late-stage dementia, exhibiting violent paranoia, extreme disorientation, and presenting an immediate severe physical danger to myself and others. The doctor explicitly recommended a permanent, highly secure institutionalization for my own safety. Bradley had not just purchased a forged power of attorney, he had purchased a medical execution order. The document authorized licensed medical orderlies to forcefully detain me against my will, sedate me if necessary, and transport me directly to a locked psychiatric facility. The bottom of the terrifying document contained a specific scheduled execution time for the medical extraction. They were not going to hunt me down. They knew exactly where I was supposed to be. They had carefully scheduled the medical transport van to arrive at my estate precisely at 8 o'clock on Friday morning. They were fully expecting me to return from my relaxing fishing trip at the lake cabin, completely unaware and entirely defenseless. They planned to ambush me the exact second I stepped out of my truck. I would be immediately overwhelmed by trained professionals injected with heavy chemical sedatives and thrown into the back of a locked transport van before I could scream for help. Once inside the sterile walls of the mental asylum, my voice would mean absolutely nothing. I would be trapped forever without any possibility of escape. Harrison stared at the glowing laptop screen, his veteran composure visibly shaken by the sheer audacity of the financial crimes. He took a deep breath, reached across the laminate table, and forcefully closed the computer. "We are going to the local authorities right now," Harrison said, his voice hard and uncompromising. He told me we needed to immediately drive down to the precinct and file an emergency police report for identity theft, malicious bank fraud, and targeted elder abuse. "We cannot let this continue for another second," he added fiercely. He insisted we drive straight to the county courthouse to file a temporary restraining order to freeze the demolition permit before the bulldozers could even touch my property. I looked at my longtime attorney, completely understanding his sharp legal instincts and his desire to protect my assets, but I slowly shook my head. I looked down at my hands and told him no. I told him that if we involve the local police right this second, we will trigger a massive, unavoidable wave of bureaucratic delays. Local detectives will want to conduct long interviews, file tedious paperwork, and pass the jurisdiction over to a financial task force. The moment Bradley catches wind of a preliminary police investigation, he will panic. He will take that $3 million sitting in that offshore holding account, wire it directly into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet in a foreign extradition country, and absolutely vanish. He will gladly leave me holding the empty bag for a massive fraudulent commercial loan, and he will happily leave his own family member to take the heavy fall for a massive federal felony while he lives in luxury overseas. "I cannot afford to simply spook them," I explained, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "I need to crush them completely at the source, and I need to do it so swiftly they do not even have time to blink." Harrison crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his sharp eyes narrowing as he analyzed my unyielding posture. He asked me what exactly I was proposing, warning me that operating completely outside the immediate protection of local law enforcement was incredibly dangerous and highly unpredictable. "You are playing a very risky game, Rick," he stated firmly. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the sticky diner table. I told him that my son possesses a fatal blinding flaw. Bradley is profoundly and fundamentally arrogant. He has never experienced true failure. He believes he is the smartest person in any room, and he completely underestimated the man who raised him. Right now, Bradley thinks he has orchestrated the perfect crime. He genuinely thinks he has secured his perfect alibi at a luxury downtown hotel, manipulated a multi-million-dollar commercial loan without any consequences, and successfully arranged for a private medical transport to quietly dispose of his wealthy, supposedly demented father. I told Harrison that we are not going to run from the trap he set. We are going to walk right into the dead center of it. We are going to use his own weaponized arrogance to permanently destroy him. Harrison looked at me as if I were a madman. He reminded me of the corrupt private physician and the involuntary psychiatric hold. He told me that if I show up at my estate on Friday morning, trained medical orderlies will physically tackle me to the ground, heavily sedate me, and legally lock me inside a mental asylum before I can even explain the situation. I smiled a cold and hollow expression that held absolutely no warmth. I told Harrison that those trained orderlies will only take me away in a straitjacket if absolutely no one else is there to witness the actual truth of the situation. The logistics of assembling this trap required a level of precision I hadn't exercised since my largest infrastructure projects. While Harrison made his classified calls, I began organizing the secondary elements of our defense. I needed absolute assurance that the banking representatives would be present. I couldn't rely on chance. Using the burner phone, I contacted a private investigator I had retained years ago for corporate background checks. His instructions were simple but critical: intercept the communication channels of the predatory lending firm and anonymously drop a highly credible tip suggesting an imminent massive structural failure at the property site. The tip needed to be alarming enough to force the senior bank auditor to personally inspect the collateral before the demolition could proceed, ensuring he arrived exactly at 8 o'clock. The private investigator's role was far more complex than just dropping a simple anonymous tip to a call center. We needed to guarantee the physical presence of a high-ranking banking executive, someone with the immediate undeniable authority to freeze a multi-million-dollar transaction right on the spot. Through Harrison's extensive corporate legal network, we entirely bypassed the local branch managers and directly contacted the regional vice president of fraud prevention for the predatory lending firm. We did not reveal our entire hand, just enough to trigger their deepest institutional paranoia. We provided them with a heavily encrypted partial dossier containing undeniable glaring irregularities in the recent land deed transfer, paired with a subtle, terrifying hint about a pending federal investigation. The mere threat of a massive financial institution being legally implicated in an unsealed SEC crypto fraud indictment was more than enough to send their entire legal department into absolute panic. They bypassed standard protocol and immediately dispatched their most senior risk assessment officer to my Franklin estate. His explicit orders were to physically halt any structural alterations or demolition until the $12 million collateral could be independently and legally verified. Knowing that this executive would arrive at exactly 8 o'clock, right alongside the heavy demolition crew and the corrupt medical orderlies, was the absolute linchpin of our entire operation. It ensured that Bradley's crucial financial lifeline would be severed publicly, irrevocably, and right in front of the federal agents. The trap we built was no longer just a simple net. It was a titanium vault, and the heavy doors were preparing to close from all sides simultaneously. Harrison's paralegal team was working relentlessly to prepare the federal injunctions. They drafted the countersuits, compiling the irrefutable evidence of the forged power of attorney and the offshore wire transfers. Every document had to be ironclad sealed by a federal judge and ready to be served the moment the trap sprang shut. We were essentially building a legal guillotine, and the blade had to fall perfectly. The sheer volume of paperwork, the coordination with federal authorities, and the meticulous timing required an almost superhuman level of focus. We worked through the night, fueled by stale diner coffee and a cold, burning desire for absolute justice. By the time the sun began to rise on Thursday morning, every piece was locked into place. The federal agents were briefed, the injunctions were signed, and the bait was set. I outlined the exact ruthless parameters of my planned counteroffensive. I desperately wanted every single participant of this malicious conspiracy standing together on my front lawn at the exact same time. I wanted the heavy demolition contractors actively idling their massive diesel-powered bulldozers in my wide driveway. I wanted the private banking representatives physically present under the clever guise of an impromptu high-level commercial site audit to verify their loan collateral. I wanted the corrupt concierge doctor waiting in his medical transport van. And most importantly, I wanted Bradley and Monica forced out of their comfortable luxury hotel suite and dragged directly to the scene of their own crime. I needed them to believe they had to rush back to the property because of a sudden, unexpected complication with the demolition crew. Harrison listened to my meticulous plan in absolute silence. He slowly nodded, the initial shock on his face melting away to reveal a sharp, predatory smile. He told me it was the most brilliant and terrifying legal ambush he had ever heard in his 40 years of practicing corporate law. But he also strictly warned me that standard local police officers would absolutely not be enough to handle a complex financial conspiracy of this massive multi-layered scale. If we wanted to permanently freeze the fraudulent $3 million loan and immediately arrest Monica for her active involvement in a federal securities scheme, we needed an agency with absolute uncompromising authority. Harrison picked up his mobile phone from the table and scrolled through his encrypted contact list. He told me that during his long career, he had done a few significant favors for some very powerful people in the federal government. It was finally time to cash in those favors. He dialed a highly classified number and waited for a connection. When the line opened, Harrison did not use names. He simply stated that he was currently sitting on a massive, highly active wire fraud conspiracy tied directly to a major recently unsealed federal indictment involving illegal offshore cryptocurrency accounts. He firmly requested the immediate heavily armed presence of specialized agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, to secure the location. He spoke in low, rapid tones outlining the exact coordinates of my Franklin estate and the specific nature of the fraudulent commercial loan. After a few tense minutes, Harrison ended the call and placed his phone back into his tailored suit pocket. He looked at me with a steady, unwavering gaze. "The trap is officially set," he said quietly. "The federal agents have confirmed their participation. They will coordinate directly with the county sheriff to secure the perimeter without alerting your son. We will converge on the property this Friday morning at exactly 8 in the morning, precisely when the heavy excavators are scheduled to begin tearing down your home." I sincerely thanked Harrison for his unwavering loyalty, paid the tired waitress with cash from my wallet, and walked right out of the diner into the bright, blinding midday sun. I felt a strange sense of absolute peace settle over my tired body. My own flesh and blood had brutally attempted to bury me alive for a pile of money, but they forgot that I had spent my entire life digging through the toughest dirt in Tennessee. I was finally returning home on Friday morning, and I was bringing a truly devastating storm they could never possibly survive. After leaving the diner and Harrison's meticulous legal war room, I did not return to the cheap roadside motel immediately. I needed to ensure my digital footprint remained flawlessly deceptive, leaving absolutely no trace for Bradley's tracking applications to catch. I rented an anonymous mid-range sedan using cash and drove to the southern edge of the county far from Franklin and miles away from the downtown luxury hotel where my son was currently hiding behind his fabricated alibi. I parked near a quiet, desolate reservoir, watching the dark gray water ripple under an overcast sky and let the sheer gravity of what I was about to do wash over me completely. For 40 years, my entire existence had been defined by building things, massive infrastructure, undeniable wealth, and a secure, impenetrable future for my family. Now I was engineering a demolition of a completely different kind. I had spent my life pouring concrete to support unimaginable weight, but I was now pouring an invisible legal concrete to permanently trap a predator who shared my last name. I sat in the cold vehicle and thought deeply about Catherine. I wondered if she would forgive me for actively tearing our remaining family apart, or if she would understand that the family she loved had already died the very second Bradley signed those forged medical documents. By nightfall, the Tennessee air grew bitter and cold, matching the temperature of my own heart. I drove back to the motel, my mind operating like a fortress of cold calculation. I spent the long, agonizing evening reviewing the architectural blueprints of my own estate on a cheap prepaid tablet, memorizing the exact sightlines from the street to the main gates. I needed to know exactly where the heavy excavators would position themselves. I needed to anticipate every possible movement the medical transport team might make when they tried to ambush me. Sleep was a biological impossibility. I sat in a lumpy armchair by the window, watching the red neon sign flicker against the rain-slicked pavement, silently counting down the hours until dawn. Friday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive dampness hanging in the cool Tennessee air. The sun was just beginning to burn through the thick layers of gray fog that blanketed my 10-acre estate. It was exactly 7:45 in the morning. I was not watching the scene unfold from the vulnerable interior of my old rusted truck. I was observing everything from the tinted, reinforced windows of a heavy black utility vehicle parked quietly at the far end of the street. My beautiful property, the absolute masterwork of my long career, was completely surrounded by the hostile machinery of its impending doom. 3 massive, bright yellow excavators sat idling aggressively at the edge of my wrought iron gates. The low, rhythmic rumble of their enormous diesel engines sent a steady vibration right through the damp pavement. A crew of rugged demolition contractors stood around the heavy machinery, drinking steaming coffee from paper cups and reviewing the structural blueprints. They were waiting for the clock to strike 8. The exact legal moment their noise permits allowed them to tear my life into dust. Friday morning did not arrive with the bright, welcoming sunrise of a typical Tennessee dawn. Instead, the sky bled into a bruised, dark purple before settling into a heavy, oppressive gray. A thick, chilling fog had rolled in off the nearby lake overnight, clinging stubbornly to the rolling hills and wrapping my 10-acre estate in a ghostly, suffocating shroud. It was the exact kind of morning that felt inherently ominous, a perfect atmospheric mirror to the dark, calculated betrayal unfolding on my property line. The neighboring houses, massive estates owned by local politicians' sons and retired corporate executives, were still completely dark. Their occupants, blissfully unaware of the intense federal sting operation, parked silently at the end of their quiet cul-de-sac. Sitting in the rear passenger seat of the heavy armored FBI utility vehicle, I watched the morning condensation bead against the dark tinted glass. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the vehicle's powerful engine and the occasional static-filled whisper of the tactical radio. The 2 federal agents sitting in the front seats were consummate professionals, their eyes scanning the perimeter with cold, practiced efficiency. They did not ask me how I was feeling. They knew this was a strictly tactical execution. Through the thick morning haze, the massive silhouettes of the yellow excavators looked like dormant mechanical beasts just waiting to be unleashed upon my life's work. The air outside was thick with the harsh metallic scent of wet asphalt and the heavy, unmistakable odor of burning diesel fuel. Every single sensory detail was permanently burned into my memory. This was the exact intersection of my life's greatest triumph and my family's greatest tragedy. I was no longer just a father watching his son fail. I was an infrastructure architect watching a flawed, deeply compromised structure finally collapse under its own toxic weight. At precisely 7:50, a sleek black sedan pulled sharply up to the edge of the driveway, kicking up a spray of loose gravel. The rear doors flew open before the vehicle even came to a complete stop. Bradley and Monica stumbled out into the morning air, and I watched their sickening, carefully rehearsed theatrical performance begin. They had dressed perfectly for their roles as the wealthy, frantic homeowners whose international business trip had been suddenly interrupted by a catastrophic misunderstanding. Bradley was wearing a rumpled designer suit, with his tie slightly loosened, actively running his hands through his hair to appear deeply stressed and exhausted from a long flight that never actually happened. Monica was clutching a heavy designer travel bag, her face buried in her hands as she let out loud, dramatic sobs for the benefit of the nosy neighbors who were already beginning to peek through their curtains. Bradley rushed forward toward the lead demolition contractor, waving his arms wildly in the air. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what on earth these bulldozers were doing on his family property. I watched his mouth move through the tinted glass of my vehicle, reading the sheer panic he was projecting. I was loudly claiming that he had just rushed back from London because his smart home application had glitched. He was playing the part of the outraged son, publicly establishing his ironclad alibi. He was meticulously laying the necessary groundwork to sue the demolition company for a catastrophic error once the house was entirely leveled. Monica leaned heavily against the stone pillar of the entrance gate, weeping loudly and wiping away non-existent tears, pretending to be absolutely devastated at the mere thought of losing the beloved family estate. Their performance was genuinely Oscar-worthy, but my attention quickly shifted away from their noisy distraction. About 200 yards down the quiet tree-lined street, parked discreetly in the heavy shadows of an old weeping willow, sat a completely unmarked white medical transport van. Its engine was silently idling, and the heavily tinted rear windows obscured the interior. But I knew exactly who was sitting inside that sterile vehicle. The corrupt, highly paid private physician was waiting patiently, with his freshly signed involuntary psychiatric hold documents resting on his lap. Sitting right beside him were two large muscular medical orderlies carrying heavy chemical sedatives and canvas restraint straps. They were not watching the bulldozers or paying any attention to Bradley and Monica putting on their loud dramatic show. They were keeping their eyes completely locked on the long, winding road leading back from the lake. They were waiting for a tired, grieving, and supposedly confused old man to pull up in a battered pickup truck. They were entirely ready to ambush me the exact second I stepped out of my vehicle, tackle me to the cold pavement, and drag me into the back of their locked van before my mind could even process the violent betrayal. They expected an easy target. They expected a fragile victim whose mind was rapidly deteriorating. The digital clock on the dashboard of my vehicle clicked to exactly 7:58 in the morning. The lead demolition contractor raised his hand, signaling his heavy crew to climb into the tall cabs of their massive yellow excavators. The loud, deafening roar of the diesel engines surged as the drivers prepared to breach the main gates of my property. Bradley stepped back, wrapping a protective arm around his weeping wife, hiding his cruel, victorious smirk behind his hand. I thought he had won. He thought he was exactly 2 minutes away from securing $12 million in commercial real estate and a massive insurance payout to cover his fraudulent cryptocurrency debt. He thought his father was about to pull into a devastating, inescapable medical trap. I took one final incredibly deep breath of the cool, conditioned air inside the vehicle. I did not feel a single ounce of fear, nor did I feel any of the suffocating, crushing sorrow that had paralyzed me earlier in the week. All the painful grief of betrayal had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and razor-focused clarity. I reached forward and firmly grasped the heavy door handle. I gave a swift, silent nod to the stern, imposing men sitting quietly in the front seats of the vehicle. It was finally time to break the illusion. The heavy black utility vehicle suddenly accelerated forward, its tires biting aggressively into the pavement. It surged directly past the unmarked medical transport van, completely ignoring the corrupt doctor waiting in the shadows. The vehicle roared up the street and swerved sharply into the center of my wide, circular driveway. It slammed to a sudden, violent halt, positioning its massive armored frame directly in the path of the advancing yellow excavators, effectively blocking the heavy machinery from moving a single inch closer to my front gates. The sudden aggressive maneuver instantly silenced the chaotic scene. The rumbling bulldozers hit their brakes. The confused contractors lowered their blueprints. Bradley abruptly dropped his protective arm from his wife, his theatrical performance completely shattering as he stared in absolute bewilderment at the imposing black vehicle blocking his demolition path. The heavy passenger door swung open. I stepped slowly out onto the damp pavement, planting my polished leather shoes firmly on the ground. I was not wearing the faded, comfortable fishing gear of a tired, confused old man returning from the lake. I was wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit from my most formidable days as a ruthless corporate chief executive officer. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders were squared, and my eyes locked directly onto my son with a cold, terrifying intensity. I did not look like a dementia patient. I looked like a man who held the power of absolute destruction right in the palms of his own two hands. Let us see exactly how well you manage to play your vicious game now that I am officially standing right here." The heavy silence that fell over the driveway was absolute and suffocating. Bradley took a sudden step backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and rising panic. He stared at my custom-tailored charcoal suit, my polished shoes, and the unwavering certainty in my posture. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant facade completely slipped, revealing the terrified, cornered child hiding underneath. He looked frantically from the massive black utility vehicle, blocking the heavy excavators, to my calm, unyielding expression. But my son had committed entirely too much to this malicious scheme to simply surrender. The fraudulent commercial loan, the impending federal investigations, and his desperate need to save his wife from a massive federal indictment forced him to double down on his vicious lie. I watched his face undergo a terrifying transformation. He forcefully buried his panic and instantly slipped right back into the meticulously rehearsed role of the devastated, deeply concerned caregiver. He raised his hands in a gesture of helpless desperation and let out a loud theatrical sob that echoed across the damp morning air. "Dad," he cried out, his voice cracking with artificial sorrow. "Dad, what on earth are you doing here? You are supposed to be resting up at the lake cabin. You are deeply confused again. You do not even know where you are right now." Bradley turned his head sharply toward the unmarked white van parked discreetly down the street and began waving his arms frantically. He was giving the prearranged signal to the corrupt concierge physician and the hired medical orderlies waiting in the shadows. "Please, somebody help him," Bradley yelled, his voice echoing with synthetic panic. "He is having another severe dementia episode. He is completely losing his grip on reality. Doctor, please come help my father before he accidentally hurts himself." The side door of the unmarked white transport van slid open with a sharp metallic clatter. Two large, broad-shouldered medical orderlies stepped out onto the wet pavement, moving with swift, practiced efficiency. They were dressed in sterile white uniforms, their faces completely devoid of any human empathy. Following closely behind them was the expensive private doctor Bradley had bribed to falsify my medical records and authorize the involuntary psychiatric hold. The doctor held a thick leather binder tightly to his chest, functioning as his shield of false legal authority. The three men marched rapidly up the long driveway, heading directly toward where I stood, positioned in front of the black utility vehicle. Monica moved to stand behind Bradley, clutching his arm and crying loudly, playing the role of the terrified daughter-in-law perfectly. The heavy demolition contractors, sitting high up in the cabs of their idling yellow excavators, watched the bizarre scene unfold with growing confusion. I did not retreat a single inch. I did not raise my hands defensively, nor did I shout angry denials about my mental state. I knew that arguing with them would only fuel their manufactured narrative of my supposed aggressive paranoia. I simply stood my ground, my hands resting casually at my sides, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying calm. The first orderly reached into the deep pocket of his white uniform as he approached the front of my vehicle. He pulled out a large, transparent medical syringe filled with a thick, cloudy sedative designed to immediately incapacitate a violent patient. He held the needle down at his side, ready to strike the moment I showed any sign of physical resistance. "Mr. Alden," the corrupt doctor said smoothly, holding up a hand in a gesture of false medical pacification, "please try to remain perfectly calm. We are simply here to help you navigate through this difficult episode. Your son loves you very much and only wants what is absolutely best for your declining health. We need you to step into the transport van right now so we can take you to a safe, quiet facility for a comprehensive evaluation." The orderly with the syringe took 2 slow, calculated steps toward me, his muscles tensing as he prepared to physically tackle me to the cold gravel. Bradley watched with breathless anticipation, a cruel, triumphant gleam hiding just behind his fake tears. He honestly believed his malicious plan was finally reaching its perfect conclusion. He believed I was exactly 5 seconds away from being chemically silenced and permanently erased from society. I looked directly into the eyes of the man holding the needle and offered a cold, hollow smile. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not run. Instead, I calmly reached my right hand into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The orderlies tensed, expecting me to pull out a weapon. Instead, I extracted a small, heavy-duty cylindrical Bluetooth loudspeaker. It was completely black, utterly unassuming, and capable of projecting sound at an incredibly high decibel level. I held the speaker casually in my left hand and pulled my mobile phone from my other pocket. I pressed a single button on the speaker, and a sharp, digital tone confirmed it was successfully paired with my device. The doctor frowned, his professional facade slipping slightly into genuine confusion. Bradley took a hesitant step forward, his fake tears instantly drying up as a sudden wave of genuine uncertainty washed over his features. "Dad." "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Put that down right now and listen to the medical professionals." I completely and utterly ignored his desperate command entirely. I slowly raised my mobile phone, opened the digital audio file I had painstakingly extracted from the hollow base of my antique grandfather clock during my midnight infiltration, and pressed the play button. I turned the volume on the mobile device all the way up to its maximum capacity. The heavy-duty Bluetooth speaker resting in the palm of my hand suddenly crackled to life, amplifying the crystal-clear digital recording across the entire expanse of my front lawn. The crisp, unmistakable voice of my daughter-in-law Monica sliced violently through the damp morning air, echoing off the stone pillars of my estate. "You really do not need to worry about any legal interference from my old father-in-law," her recorded voice announced smoothly, dripping with venomous confidence. "We have already taken care of all the necessary paperwork, and we are managing his sudden, tragic mental decline very closely." The recording paused for a fraction of a second before delivering the ultimate devastating blow. As long as the old man is legally locked inside the secure psychiatric ward by Friday morning, the $12 million commercial rezoning deal is completely and entirely ours. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of her amplified words hung heavily in the freezing morning mist. The absolute silence that followed was completely deafening. High above us, the lead demolition contractor reached forward and forcefully killed the massive diesel engine of his heavy yellow excavator. The two other machine operators quickly followed his lead, plunging the driveway into a sudden, eerie stillness. The medical orderly holding the sedative syringe froze completely mid-step, his eyes darting frantically between the speaker in my hand and the suddenly pale, terrified face of my treacherous son. The heavy silence following the digital recording was shattered by the sharp crunching of gravel at the main entrance. The medical orderly preparing to forcefully inject me lowered his trembling hand, taking a deliberate step backward. He looked at the corrupt private physician seeking guidance, but the highly paid doctor was already backing away toward his white transport van, clutching his fraudulent medical binder against his chest like a useless shield. Bradley stood paralyzed in the damp driveway, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to formulate a plausible lie. But before he could speak, the imposing iron gates of my property swung fully open. A second black utility vehicle roared aggressively up the long driveway, followed closely by a marked county sheriff cruiser, with its blue and red emergency lights flashing silently in the morning mist. The two vehicles parked at sharp angles, effectively barricading the main exit and trapping every single person on the property. The heavy doors of the utility vehicle opened. Harrison Blake stepped out onto the wet pavement. My longtime corporate attorney looked like a perfectly tailored executioner. His posture was rigid, his sharp eyes locking onto my son, with a gaze devoid of human sympathy. Walking closely behind Harrison were two broad-shouldered men wearing dark navy windbreakers with the initials of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The county sheriff stepped out of his marked cruiser, resting his hand casually on his duty belt as he surveyed the chaotic scene. He walked directly toward the unmarked medical transport van, completely ignoring the massive excavators and confused demolition contractors. The sheriff stopped right in front of the corrupt concierge doctor, towering over the nervous man. "I need to see the involuntary psychiatric hold documents you are carrying in that binder right now," the sheriff demanded, his voice carrying a hard edge. The doctor hesitated, stammering something about strict patient confidentiality laws. The sheriff did not entertain the weak protest. He firmly snatched the leather binder from the doctor and quickly scanned the forged documents. "These legal papers are officially suspended, pending a severe federal investigation into coordinated medical fraud and targeted elder abuse," the sheriff announced loudly. "You and your orderlies are going to remain exactly where you are." Bradley watched the sudden law enforcement intervention with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. His meticulously planned execution of my independence was rapidly disintegrating right in front of his very own eyes. He turned his head quickly, desperately looking for Monica, but she had already taken several rapid steps away from him, her eyes darting frantically around the enclosed driveway like a trapped animal calculating its only possible route of escape. Harrison ignored my son entirely and walked directly toward a sharply dressed man standing near the heavy demolition equipment. This man was the senior bank representative who had been dispatched to officially oversee the clearing of the residential lot to finalize collateral for the massive commercial loan. He was holding a clipboard, looking completely bewildered by the sudden influx of federal agents and county police officers. Harrison reached into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally binding folder stamped with a prominent federal court seal. He forcefully shoved the heavy document directly into the chest of the startled bank representative. "You need to read this federal injunction immediately," Harrison instructed, his voice booming across the quiet lawn so Bradley could hear every devastating syllable. "The $3 million commercial bridge loan your lending firm authorized yesterday is based entirely on a forged power of attorney. My client Richard Alden never signed those financial documents, nor did he ever consent to the commercial rezoning of this private property." The bank representative quickly opened the folder, his eyes widening as he read the federal court order. Harrison did not give him a chance to respond before delivering the final blow. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, his tone dripping with absolute legal authority, "the massive offshore wire transfer your institution processed yesterday has been fully intercepted. The funds are currently frozen by the federal government due to their direct connection to an active international money laundering investigation. You have absolutely no legal right to authorize the destruction of this property, and your financial institution is now deeply implicated in a massive wire fraud conspiracy." The color completely drained from the bank representative's face. He looked at the federal injunction and then at the FBI agents securing the perimeter, and finally at the demolition contractors sitting in their yellow excavators. "Shut it down," the representative yelled frantically, waving his arms at the heavy machinery operators. "Shut the engines down and pack up your equipment right now. We are terminating this entire project immediately." The massive diesel engines sputtered and died, plunging the estate back into a cold, heavy silence. The physical threat to my beautiful home was officially neutralized. Bradley dropped to his knees on the damp gravel, his designer suit soaking up the dirty water. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a raw, pathetic sound of absolute defeat. The $3 million loan was frozen. The commercial land sale was dead. The medical ambush had failed completely. He had absolutely nothing left to protect him from the massive federal consequences of his own reckless greed. While Bradley collapsed into a puddle of self-pity, his wife was quietly executing her own desperate contingency plan. I watched Monica slowly backing away from the center of the driveway, slipping silently into the heavy shadows cast by the tall oak trees. She abandoned her husband without a second thought, her eyes fixed entirely on the idling ride-share vehicle that had dropped them off earlier that morning. She reached into her designer bag, pulling out her passport and a thick stack of emergency cash she had undoubtedly prepared for this exact scenario. She knew the offshore cryptocurrency scheme had been breached. She knew her brother was facing imminent federal indictment. She was abandoning her marriage and attempting to flee the country. She reached the rear door of the black sedan, her hand trembling as she pulled the heavy metal handle. The door did not budge at all. The driver locked it. Monica tapped frantically on the tinted glass, looking over her shoulder to see if anyone noticed her escape. She turned back, preparing to shout at the driver, but she never got the chance. A tall, imposing figure in a dark navy windbreaker stepped smoothly out from behind the trunk of the car, completely blocking her only path to freedom. It was one of the federal agents Harrison had brought to the property. He stood with his hands resting casually on his tactical belt, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. Monica stumbled backward, her designer bag slipping from her grasp and spilling her passport onto the wet pavement. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of plausible lie or desperate bribe, but the agent did not give her the opportunity to spin another web of deceit. He looked down at her with cold, uncompromising professionalism. "Ma'am, you are a flight risk in an ongoing SEC crypto fraud investigation." The federal agent's voice hung heavy and absolute in the damp morning air, sealing my daughter-in-law's fate. Monica stared blankly at the dark navy windbreaker, blocking her escape, the stack of emergency cash slowly slipping from her trembling fingers and scattering across the wet pavement of the driveway. She did not attempt to argue or negotiate. The sheer presence of federal law enforcement crushed her arrogant spirit in an instant. I shifted my gaze away from her silent surrender and looked back toward the center of the estate entrance. The imposing yellow excavators sat entirely motionless, their massive steel buckets resting harmlessly on the gravel. The demolition contractors had quietly climbed down from their heavy machinery, packing away their blueprints and retreating to their trucks to distance themselves from the unfolding legal nightmare. The grand, meticulously planned execution of my life was officially dead. I turned my attention back to the man who had orchestrated this entire tragedy. Bradley was standing alone in the middle of the driveway, entirely isolated from his fleeing allies and his detained wife. I watched the last remaining shreds of his carefully constructed, arrogant facade crumble away. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid, his chest heaving under his expensive designer suit. He looked at the federal agents securing the perimeter, then at the severe expression on Harrison Blake's face, and finally his panicked eyes locked directly onto mine. For the first time in his adult life, my son realized that he possessed absolutely no leverage, no clever escape route, and no manipulated narrative to hide behind. The reality of a federal prison sentence was staring him directly in the face. Bradley's knees suddenly buckled beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the damp, sharp gravel of the driveway, completely ignoring the muddy water soaking right through the fabric of his tailored trousers. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a raw, guttural sound of desperation. When he finally looked up at me, his face was deeply flushed and covered in genuine, terrified tears. He crawled forward on his knees, the sharp stones tearing at his expensive clothing, closing the distance between us until he was looking up at me from the dirt. "Dad. Please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "Dad, you have to stop them. They are going to put me in a federal prison. You cannot let them take me away like this. I am your son. I am your only flesh and blood. Please, I just made a terrible mistake. I was desperate, and I made a mistake." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken man, weeping at my leather shoes. I searched my heart for a single ounce of paternal pity, a solitary drop of the deep, enduring love that had defined my entire existence as a father. I expected to feel the familiar protective instinct that compels a parent to shield their child from the harsh consequences of the world. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. The profound betrayal he had orchestrated had completely severed the sacred, invisible bond of our bloodline. I did not see a son pleading for redemption. I saw a ruthless predator begging for mercy only because his teeth had finally been broken. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic of the audio receiver I had used to record his sinister conversation the night before. I looked down at his tear-stained face, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch between us until his frantic sobbing began to subside into anxious, heavy breathing. "You did not make a mistake, Bradley," I said, my voice dangerously soft and steady, carrying clearly across the quiet fog-covered lawn. "Spilling a glass of water is a mistake. Taking a wrong turn on the highway is a mistake. What you did was draft a meticulous, highly calculated blueprint for my absolute destruction." He opened his mouth to offer another weak defense, but I immediately held up a hand, silencing him with a sharp, commanding gesture. "You spent months studying the specific legal vulnerabilities of my estate." I continued, my tone growing sharper and more precise with every word. "You deliberately forged my personal signature to secure a $3 million fraudulent commercial loan to cover your wife's criminal family. You hired professional demolition crews to tear down the beautiful sanctuary I built for your dying mother, planning to commit massive insurance fraud in the aftermath. And when you realized I was the only standing obstacle to your newfound wealth, you did not hesitate to eliminate me. You actively bribed a corrupt physician to falsify my medical records. You scheduled a private transport van to ambush me at my own home, forcefully sedate me, and lock me inside a sterile psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. You orchestrated my social death, my total financial ruin, and my permanent mental incarceration. You are not a son. You are a parasite." Bradley flinched violently, physically recoiling, as if my words had struck him across the face. He looked around the property, his eyes darting frantically toward the federal agents who were now standing over Monica, securing her hands behind her back. He realized that apologies and emotional manipulation would not save him from the impending legal avalanche. He quickly shifted his strategy, reverting to the only language he truly understood. He attempted to negotiate a financial settlement from his knees. "Dad, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice dropping into a desperate, hurried whisper. "You do not have to press any charges. You can just tell the federal agents that this was all a massive misunderstanding regarding the power of attorney. We can call off the demolition entirely. You can just keep the $12 million commercial property all to yourself, and Monica and I will simply walk away forever. We will never bother you again. Just let us go and you can keep the entire fortune." I stared down at him, utterly disgusted by his final pathetic attempt to barter with his own freedom, using my own stolen assets as the primary currency. He honestly believed that the promise of immense commercial wealth would be enough to buy my silence and secure his escape. He fundamentally misunderstood everything I valued in this world. I did not build my life around the relentless pursuit of money. I built it around the undeniable importance of integrity, hard work, and the absolute protection of my family. He had completely destroyed the latter, and I was not about to compromise the former to save a criminal. I would never let him exploit me ever again. A cold, razor-sharp smile slowly formed on my face. I looked out over the sprawling 10-acre estate, taking in the beautiful mature oak trees, the meticulously manicured gardens, and the pristine hand-built sunroom that held the very best memories of my late wife. I looked back down at the weeping, pathetic man kneeling in the wet gravel of my driveway. "I am not keeping this property," I told him, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or hesitation. "And neither are you." The words echoed across the damp pavement, freezing Monica in place. The federal agent stepped forward with uncompromising authority and grasped her wrist effortlessly, pulling her away from the ride-share vehicle. The stack of emergency she had desperately tried to gather lay scattered across the wet gravel, the $100 bills soaking up muddy water like useless debris. For a fleeting second, Monica tried to maintain her aristocratic demeanor. She raised her chin, her eyes flashing with indignant fury, and opened her mouth to demand her private attorney. But the sheer weight of the federal badge pinned to the agent's windbreaker silenced her completely. She knew there was absolutely no legal loophole, no clever manipulation, and no amount of fabricated tears that could possibly extract her from the crushing reality of a federal indictment. The agent swiftly maneuvered her arms behind her back, and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely into place resonated across the silent driveway. While the federal agents secured my daughter-in-law, the county sheriff turned his unyielding attention back to the corrupt physician standing near the unmarked white transport van. The highly paid doctor who had willingly traded his medical ethics for my son's dirty money was actively attempting to inch his way back into his vehicle. "You are not going anywhere," the sheriff commanded, his voice booming with absolute authority. The sheriff closed the distance between them in 3 rapid strides, completely ignoring the 2 muscular medical orderlies who wisely took several steps backward, holding their hands up to clearly signal their immediate surrender. The doctor stammered weakly, aggressively, clutching his fraudulent medical binder, frantically trying to cite patient confidentiality laws. The sheriff did not entertain a single syllable of his desperate medical defense. He forcefully snatched the leather binder away, tossing it onto the hood of the marked police cruiser. "You are officially under arrest for severe medical fraud, the falsification of binding legal health records, and active participation in a coordinated conspiracy to commit targeted elder abuse," the sheriff stated firmly. He grabbed the doctor by the shoulders, spun him around, and forcefully pushed him against the cold metal side of the transport van. The physician let out a pathetic gasp as the sheriff secured his wrists in heavy iron cuffs, firmly guiding him into the back seat of the police cruiser. The man who had callously signed away my freedom was now entirely stripped of his own, with the medical threat completely neutralized and the fraudulent demolition halted. The lead federal agent turned his calculating focus directly toward Bradley. My son was still kneeling in the wet gravel of the driveway, his expensive designer suit thoroughly ruined by the mud, his entire body trembling violently with raw, unfiltered terror. 2 federal agents approached him simultaneously, grabbing him by the arms and dragging him forcefully to his feet. Bradley did not fight them. He lacked the physical strength and the moral courage to mount any kind of resistance. His legs gave out beneath him, forcing the agents to support his dead weight as they dragged him toward the waiting black utility vehicles. The lead agent stepped directly in front of my weeping son, raising his voice so the official words carried clearly over the low rumble of the idling police engines. "Bradley Alden and Monica Alden, you are both officially under federal arrest for severe conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive bank fraud, and aggravated elder abuse," the agent announced, his tone devoid of human sympathy. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The iconic, devastating words of the Miranda warning washed over my son like a physical blow, permanently cementing the terrifying reality of his total destruction. As the federal agents forcefully shoved them toward the reinforced back doors of the separate transport vehicles, the fragile, toxic alliance between my son and his wife violently shattered. Monica twisted aggressively in the firm grip of the agent holding her, her face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. She glared fiercely at Bradley, her eyes burning with a venomous rage that made my blood run cold. "You pathetic, useless coward!" Monica screamed at the top of her lungs, abandoning any remaining shred of her calculated persona. "You promised me this was absolutely foolproof. You promised me the old man was too weak to fight back. You have completely ruined my entire life." She spat the venomous words at him, viciously cursing his name, his arrogance, and his catastrophic failure to secure the $12 million commercial property. Bradley did not yell back. He did not attempt to defend his broken pride or quiet his screaming wife. He simply hung his head in crushing defeat and sobbed uncontrollably. His loud wails echoed pitifully across the damp lawn as the federal agents forcefully pushed his head down, shoving him unceremoniously into the dark back seat of the armored vehicle. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with deafening finality, trapping my only son inside a rolling steel cage of his own meticulous design. I stood perfectly still on the wet pavement, watching the flashing emergency lights reflect brightly off the dark windows of the departing federal vehicles. I watched the police cruisers slowly turn around in my wide driveway, kicking up loose gravel as they escorted my treacherous family off my property for the very last time. I waited for the familiar suffocating wave of paternal grief to wash over me. I expected to feel the profound, agonizing sorrow of a father watching his only child taken away in heavy steel handcuffs. But as I watched the taillights disappear down the long country road, I felt absolutely no sorrow whatsoever. Instead, a heavy hollow ache settled deep inside my chest, accompanied by the terrifying clarity of a man who had just narrowly survived an aggressive assassination attempt orchestrated by his very own blood. Bradley had not just tried to steal my money. I had meticulously plotted to erase my mind, strip away my basic human dignity, and bury me alive inside a sterile locked room. I had successfully excised a deadly malignant tumor from my life, and the overwhelming feeling radiating through my tired bones was simply the absolute peaceful relief of genuine survival. The marked police cars and heavy utility vehicles drove away, leaving the estate. Seeing their lucrative contract voided, the demolition contractors packed up their architectural blueprints. They climbed into the tall cabs of their yellow excavators, slowly reversing the heavy machinery down the driveway and exiting through the iron gates. Within 10 minutes, the sprawling property was completely silent, wrapped once again in the peaceful morning mist. The silence, however, felt entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of isolation, but the crisp, clean stillness of a battlefield after a decisive victory. I walked slowly across the damp gravel, my footsteps echoing against the stone pillars. I traced my hand along the wrought iron gates, feeling the solid, unyielding metal. The betrayal had cut deeper than I ever thought possible, a wound inflicted by the very hands I had spent my life trying to protect. Yet, standing there, amidst the dissipating fog, I realized I had not merely survived the assault. I had reclaimed my sovereignty. The coming months would undoubtedly be arduous. There would be lengthy federal trials, exhaustive depositions, and the painful process of legally dismantling the remnants of Bradley's fraudulent empire. I would have to watch my only son face the severe consequences of his actions in a courtroom. It was a prospect that brought me no joy, only a profound, weary resignation. But I knew with absolute certainty that I possessed the strength to endure it. I had built a legacy based on integrity, and I would fiercely defend it, regardless of the personal cost. Harrison Blake walked across the gravel, stopping right beside me. He placed a steady, reassuring hand on my shoulder, looking out at the empty driveway. "Are you going to be okay?" Rick, my attorney, asked quietly. I did not answer him immediately. I slowly turned my head and looked deeply at the handcrafted sunroom I had painstakingly built for my late wife. The glass was perfectly intact, catching the early morning light in a brilliant display of resilience. "I am going to need a new housekeeper," I said quietly. If my journey of standing up to betrayal resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.